My name is Kimberly, and I'm 34 years old. I live with my husband, Mark. We both work at a company that was started by Mark's father. Even though he's retired now, Mark's father grew a small construction company into a business worth $2.5 billion. He made some bold decisions like buying other construction companies, and people admire his great business skills. Mark took over the company after his father retired. He grew up being gentle and a bit spoiled. While Mark is kind, I sometimes think he's not decisive enough to be a good husband and company leader. Mark has said things like, "I'm not meant to be an executive, so I'll probably just be a figurehead president." That would be easier for me. He doesn't seem serious about running the company. We've been married for 5 years, but recently I've been unhappy with Mark's lack of drive. Unlike my husband, I believe I can make decisions well. When my father-in-law was active in the company, he seemed to value that about me and gave me important responsibilities. Before I married Mark, I worked at a bank, so numbers and finances have always been a big part of my work life. After getting married, I planned to be a full-time homemaker, but my father-in-law asked me to join the construction company. Once I started working there, my father-in-law included me in high-level meetings where we discussed how to manage the company. At first, other executives were surprised to see me there because I'm the founder's daughter-in-law, but they started to respect my opinions as I contributed thoughtful ideas. Mark, who was also an executive, never attended these meetings, and everyone, including my father-in-law, seemed fine with that. When I got home from these meetings, I'd often find Mark relaxing and watching TV. "Why weren't you at today's meeting? You're an important executive. You need to take responsibility," I asked him, frustrated. Mark responded without remorse, saying, "Even if I went, I wouldn't understand what's going on, and the executives prefer you anyway, so it's fine." He seemed to dismiss my involvement in the board meetings, perhaps finding it bothersome. Meanwhile, my father-in-law appeared to be grooming me to take over the company, teaching me everything about running the business. As someone new to managing a business, I found the work fulfilling and aimed to meet his expectations. About 2 years after I started attending meetings, my father-in-law retired completely. The executives started coming to me for important decisions, sidelining Mark. I thought this would motivate Mark to focus more, but instead he became even less committed. He would show up at the office in the morning but leave by noon, heading straight home. At home, he never mentioned work and seemed completely uninterested in the company. Meanwhile, I was getting more and more busy with increased responsibilities at work. After my father-in-law retired, the executives started relying on me heavily, and I was handling tasks similar to those of a CEO. The company was large, with many employees, and I worked hard to boost sales and profits for everyone's benefit. Thanks to the efforts of our team, sales were rising, and I found managing the company increasingly exciting, fully immersed in my work. Meanwhile, Mark seemed to be losing interest in his job, and his presence at the company was dwindling. Our conversations at home became fewer, and our marriage started to feel strained. Then, one day, Mark came home and casually mentioned, "I bumped into your sister today, and we had lunch together." My sister, who is 2 years older, had recently gone through a divorce because of an affair. Her angry ex-husband had caused quite a scene at our family home, and Mark, who had more free time than me, went there to calm him down with his gentle and easygoing manner. Surprisingly, my pampered husband managed to defuse the situation. My sister told me, "Being a CEO is amazing. He easily diffused my raging husband." "Oh," she praised him. It seemed that Mark's calm and cheerful demeanor had disarmed my sister's angry husband completely. My sister ended her marriage by paying compensation to her ex-husband, and since that incident, her opinion of Mark seemed to change. Before, she had viewed Mark, who was impressive-looking but seemed indecisive, as just a wealthy, spoiled man. Now she seemed to see him as a capable CEO of a company. Being single again, my sister, who always admired wealthy men, must have seen Mark as a good catch. But I, immersed in my work, had never considered such a possibility. Little did my sister know that Mark was merely a figurehead executive not involved in the company's management. Her ex-husband, an elite employee at a foreign company, was proud of his career and looks. At her wedding, she bragged to me, "My husband is a top employee with a handsome salary. Plus, he's good-looking, so you must be envious." Her ex-husband indeed had charm and seemed sharp and stylish whenever he spoke. I couldn't fathom why she would cheat on such an excellent husband. 3 months after Mark told me about having dinner with my sister, I returned home to find him looking unusually serious. "Kimberly, I need to talk to you." It was the first time he had spoken those words, and I felt a sense of dread. As I anxiously waited for him to continue, he dropped a bombshell. "The truth is, your sister is pregnant with my child, and I want a divorce." I was stunned by both the request for a divorce and the news of my sister's pregnancy. Shocked into silence, I couldn't respond, and Mark went on, "She wants to come over on her next day off to talk about everything, so please be prepared." Confused and trying to process everything, I asked him, "So you want to marry my sister?" Mark looked troubled as he answered, I don't really want to marry her, but with a child involved, we might not have a choice. Feeling frustrated with Mark's indecisiveness, I sighed and said, well, if there's a child on the way, we may not have a choice. Let's discuss this when my sister comes over. Seeing that talking to Mark wasn't getting us anywhere, I decided I would meet with my sister directly to figure things out. I had already decided to pursue a divorce, but I knew I needed to discuss the company's affairs with my father-in-law first. Despite being involved in the company as his daughter-in-law, divorcing would make me an outsider. The next day, I went to my in-law's house and told my father-in-law what Mark had told me. My mother-in-law, who was there, initially seemed pleased about the pregnancy news, but fell silent when my father-in-law gave her a stern look. It appeared she cared more about having a grandchild than the company's management. After some thought, my father-in-law smiled and said, Kimberly, you will continue to manage the company as you have been. Mark's situation is irrelevant to me. I'll handle it, so do what you think is best with him. Clearly, the company's management mattered more to my father-in-law than his son or a grandchild. Even though he was retired, my father-in-law still held sway in the company, and with the majority of the company's shares under his control, no executives dared to defy him. Besides, I found fulfillment in my work, so giving up now would have been a waste. With work matters settled, it was time to discuss the future with my sister. On her day off, my sister arrived at my house with a smug smile, saying, Poor Kimberly, you couldn't have a child. I'll compensate you generously. Haha, now leave this house immediately. She spoke triumphantly, looking pleased with herself. Meanwhile, my husband sat there quietly, not contributing to the conversation despite being the root cause of the problem. His indifferent expression frustrated me so much that I said, I agree to the divorce, but we also need to discuss compensation and divide our property. Let's bring in a lawyer to handle this properly. I never imagined you'd end up with someone like Mark. He doesn't compare to your ex. I added a touch of sarcasm as I spoke to my sister, who glared at me fiercely for a moment before regaining her composure. I finally get it. It's not about a man's appearance, it's about who he really is inside, she said, as if she had figured out my husband's true character. Suppressing my amusement, I replied, Well, I guess that's good for you. Enjoy your life with Mark from now on. I suspected her idea of inner self might just mean money. She seemed to have believed my husband was the CEO of my father-in-law's company, though it was clear she hadn't heard much directly from him. After our discussion, my sister announced she was moving in and had movers ready. I had anticipated her impulsiveness and already arranged for a new apartment. With a lawyer by my side, I had prepared documents for property division and compensation claims. The next day after moving out, negotiations began. During the talks, my husband remained passive, seemingly uninvolved, while my sister did all the talking. As I've said, I'm willing to pay any amount for compensation, so just decide, my sister declared. Hearing this, my lawyer decided to pursue compensation not just from my husband, but also from my sister. Despite earlier warnings that getting compensation from her might be difficult due to previous obligations, my lawyer saw an opportunity since she had openly agreed to pay. When it came to dividing property, my sister confidently stated, This mansion originally belonged to Mark's family, so it shouldn't be included in the division, right? The lawyer responded calmly, This property is owned by the company, so that decision lies with the company. My husband, thinking it was his father's property, asked, Really? This house wasn't my dad's? He didn't seem surprised. In contrast, my sister panicked and snapped at the lawyer, Wait, so does that mean I can't live here? The lawyer replied matter-of-factly, Since it's company property, you can stay here if the company approves. My sister visibly relaxed upon hearing this. Okay, why didn't you say that earlier? It's fine because Mark, the CEO, lives here, right? She asked, assuming Mark held a high position. The lawyer was momentarily surprised, then burst into laughter. What are you talking about? Your sister is the CEO. The lawyer continued to laugh, looking at my sister, who seemed shocked by the revelation. She immediately turned to my husband, exclaiming, Wait, Mark, you're not the CEO. Instead of responding, my husband looked troubled. I clarified for her that Mark was just an advisor without any authority to act on behalf of the company. I, on the other hand, was an executive officer and had been promoted to CEO by my father-in-law when he retired. This decision was supported by other executives due to my contributions, and there were no objections. As for Mark, his father had arranged for him to receive an executive salary as an advisor, despite not actively working. Consequently, the salary was less than that of a regular employee, and I was covering all our living expenses. My husband seemed indifferent to our household finances, showing little concern whether the house we lived in belonged to the company or his father. I had been paying rent to my responsible father-in-law, thinking of it as a regular rental property. The lawyer, amused, asked me, Is it okay to continue renting this house to Mark? My sister reacted strongly to the mention of rent. What do you mean rent? He shouldn't have to pay rent. It's company property, right? He should live here for free. The lawyer chuckled again at my sister's remark and presented the rent amount. Both my sister and husband were taken aback upon learning about the rent for the first time. Given the size of the house, the rent was substantial, far beyond what I could afford on my salary alone. Even with my husband's salary, paying the rent would leave us with very little for living expenses. As for the division of property during our 5-year marriage, my husband's modest executive salary was spent entirely on daily expenses, while my higher salary went towards covering the hefty rent and other living costs, leaving little accumulated savings or property. Ultimately, we divided what little savings we had. After the lawyer left, my sister, who had expected to live in this grand mansion, looked visibly disappointed. Meanwhile, my husband, seemingly unaffected, continued to smile as usual. Frustrated, I suggested, "Your mom was happy about you having a child, so why don't you move back to your parents' house?" He agreed, but I couldn't help but laugh at why I was still being considerate towards my soon-to-be ex-husband. I started to worry about whether such an unreliable husband could responsibly raise a child, but I realized it was no longer my concern, so I left that decision to my sister. My sister seemed to have forgotten about her own compensation payment. I tried to clarify, "Sis, are you okay with the compensation payment? You were talking confidently, but you were still making payments to your ex-husband, right?" She looked surprised and seemed to snap out of her previous mindset. "Wait, do I have to pay compensation too?" My husband jumped in, seeming flustered, as if he hadn't been listening. "Even though we discussed this today, you said, 'I'll compensate you generously,' but you weren't talking about me, were you? My salary is really low." My husband and sister exchanged bewildered looks. Although I couldn't believe it, I had to hold back laughter watching their exchange. For my part, I no longer cared, as I had already finalized the divorce and compensation agreements with their signatures. However, my husband and sister appeared pitiful. My ex-husband, who had married my sister, followed my suggestion to return to his parents' home. Yet it seemed that they were constantly arguing. The root cause was the revelation that my sister's claim of being pregnant with my ex-husband's child was false. His mother, who had anticipated an heir, was furious. His father, who had never been fond of my sister for taking my ex-husband away from me, reportedly never spoke to her again. As for the compensation, my ex-husband's father paid his share in full. However, my sister pleaded with her father-in-law to cover her compensation too. He angrily retorted, "You have no right to call me father." Disappointed and empty-handed, my sister fled from my ex-husband's family home and has been missing ever since. It seems she only remarried my ex-husband to avoid paying compensation. My ex-husband briefly considered reconciling with me, but his father sternly admonished him, saying, "You shouldn't even think about starting a family. You can't even take care of yourself." I have no intention of reconciling with him either, having lost all trust when he betrayed me with my sister. His indifferent attitude during our discussions disgusted me further. Subsequently, he was dismissed from his executive position, resigned, and now works as a temp. Meanwhile, I have continued as the CEO of my company and am content without thoughts of remarriage, as I find fulfillment in my work. Even after separating from my ex-husband, I maintain a close relationship with my father-in-law, seeking his counsel during challenging times. For now, I see myself married to my work, dedicated to the welfare of my employees.